The night Jonah Redfield died, the wind came through the east wall, like it had a mind to take the rest of the house with him. Mara stood beside the bed with one hand pressed to her husband's chest, waiting for it to rise again. It did not. For a while she stayed that way, her palm resting over the stillness beneath his nightshirt, feeling for the man who had been there an hour before. The fever had burned him down in 4 days. 4 days from the first cough to the last breath. 4 days from a husband standing in the doorway with snow on his shoulders to a body under a quilt in a room that suddenly seemed too small to hold all that had been lost. Outside, December held the Bitterroot Valley in a hard, white fist. Snow pressed against the windows. The roof beams complained. Somewhere beyond the house, the mule gave a lonely bray from the shed, and the sound moved across the yard and died in the wind. Mara did not scream. She did not fall to her knees. She pulled the blanket up to Jonah's chin because his shoulders looked cold, and because her hands still knew the habits of loving him even after breath had left him. Then she turned from the bed and went into the main room where 6 children slept in a heap of quilts near the stove. Caleb, 15, lay nearest the door with one arm thrown over his face, already too long in the bones and too young in the grief that was coming for him. Naomi slept curled around Clara, one hand tucked against the little girl's back. Levi had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, his chin on his chest, as if even sleep had found him thinking. Silas lay awake. Mara saw his eyes open in the stove glow dark and fixed on her. He knew. 9 years old, and he knew from the way she stood. Mara crossed the room and put another log on the fire. The children would wake cold if she did not. They would wake fatherless either way, but there was no need for them to wake cold too. By morning, Caleb had taken Jonah's pickaxe and gone out to the ridge above the house where the ground was least rocky. He swung at the frozen earth until his palms split. Mara told him once to stop and come warm himself. He didn't hear her, or pretended not to. So she stood beside him in the gray morning while the wind pulled at her black shawl and watched her eldest son beat a grave into land that did not want to open. Every strike sent a dull iron sound across the snow. Levi stood nearby holding the shovel. Naomi kept the younger girls in the house. Silas sat on the step with a scrap of pine in one hand and Jonah's small carving knife in the other, shaving thin curls of wood into his lap without making anything clear. When the hole was deep enough, they wrapped Jonah in the good quilt his mother had sewn back in Missouri. Mara wanted to say words over him, but the cold took language out of her mouth. Caleb stood with his jaw locked so tight she thought his teeth might break. Annie asked if Papa could hear the wind underground. No one answered her. Mara filled the grave herself. By the 3rd week of December, the food had begun telling the truth. There was cornmeal enough for perhaps 12 days if she stretched it, beans less than that, salt pork a narrow strip wrapped in cloth and hanging from the rafters like an accusation. Jonah's rifle stood by the door, but Mara had never been the one to hunt. Jonah had known where elk moved after a storm and how to read the sky when the clouds came low off the Bitterroots. Jonah had known which men in town would extend credit and which would smile while saying no. Mara knew children. She knew fever. She knew how to mend a coat until the original cloth was mostly memory. She knew how to make hunger seem like patience to little ones. But Winter was not moved by what a woman knew. So she put on every layer she owned, left Caleb in charge, and walked the hard road into Bitterroot Crossing. Mayor Ephraim Voss received her in his office behind the meeting hall where a stove glowed red and coffee sat untouched on his desk. He was a narrow man with a soft voice and eyes that weighed things without seeming to. Mara had never thought him cruel before. Careful, yes, self-important often, but not cruel. She changed her mind before he finished speaking. Mara, he said, folding his hands as the whole settlement mourns Jonah. He was a steady man. He was. And we want to help where help can be given. I need winter credit at Ferris's store, she said. Meal, beans, salt. Come spring I can plant. Caleb can work. I'm not asking charity forever. Voss looked down at his hands. That was when she knew. There are concerns, he said. Concerns. 6 children are a considerable burden for one woman in a winter like this. Mara felt something inside her go very still. He spoke carefully then, as men do when they have placed a knife under a cloth and mean to pretend it is not there. There were families willing to take the younger girls. Naomi could be useful in the Carver household. Levi might go to the Hanley's farm. Silas to the Mercer couple who had no children of their own. Caleb was strong enough for the North logging crew. Temporary arrangements, Voss said. Only until spring. No. The word came out quiet. Voss blinked. You should think on it. I have thought on my children since the hour each of them was born. No one doubts your devotion. Then do not speak of taking them from me as if you were discussing borrowed tools. His mouth tightened. The council has a duty to prevent suffering. The council met about my family. He looked away. When last Tuesday. The room seemed to narrow around her. Last Tuesday, Jonah had still been warm in the ground. Last Tuesday, Silas had not yet spoken more than 3 words in a day. Last Tuesday, Mara had been counting beans by candlelight, believing hunger was the worst thing coming. You divided them already, she said. We considered possibilities. You named houses. He said nothing. You named work. Still nothing. Mara stood her hand steady as she pulled on her gloves. Give me 1 week. The weather is turning. Give me 1 week. Voss studied her with the look of a man granting mercy that cost him nothing. 1 week. But if there is no other suitable arrangement, you must understand we will act in the children's best interest. Mara looked at him, then really looked. You do not get to break a thing and call the pieces safer. She left before he could answer. Outside, the cold hit her hard enough to steal her breath. The main street of Bitterroot Crossing lay under a low, gray sky, horses standing hip-shot before the store smoke rising from chimneys, people moving quickly between doors with their collars turned up. A town full of roofs, a town full of stoves, a town full of people who had decided her children could survive only if they stopped being hers. She had taken 10 steps toward home when she heard voices from the meeting hall. Jonah would have kept walking, perhaps. Jonah believed in hearing a man out only when that man had earned the right to speak. Mara turned back. The meeting hall was crowded. She slipped in through the rear door and stayed where the lamplight thinned. Voss stood at the front with Dale Ferris from the general store, Reverend Cole, 2 councilmen and several families whose names had just been attached to her children. They were not debating whether. They were discussing how. Caleb's near-grown Ferris said, Logging will put discipline in him. He is 15, someone answered. 15 is old enough to swing an axe. The little girls should stay together, Reverend Cole said, as if that kindness cleaned the rest of it. Mara gripped the back of a bench until the wood edge bit her palm. Old Amos Pike sat near the stove, his white beard tucked into his coat. One bad leg stretched before him. He had driven mule teams before half the town had roofs. He had traded with Salish camps, married 2 wives, and learned to say little because most people did not listen anyway. But he listened now. And then he spoke. A family is not a sack of flour to be divided by weight. The hall went quiet enough for Mara to hear the lampwicks hiss. Ferris shifted. No one is dividing flour. Amos said. Flour would be handled gentler. A few eyes dropped. Then someone near the door muttered, What about Tahu Lone Elk? The name moved through the room like a draft under a door. Voss stiffened. That is not a serious suggestion. He has a cabin, the man said, high on the north slope. Food stores too likely. He's half wild, Ferris said. He's half Salish, Amos said. That ain't the same thing unless a man's ignorance needs feeding. He lives alone, Voss said. A widow and 6 children cannot be sent up a mountain to a man like that. The front door opened. Wind struck the lamps. Several flames leaned sideways. The man who stepped inside had to lower his head beneath the frame. He wore a long hide coat darkened by weather, and his black hair, streaked with gray at the temples, was tied back with a strip of leather. A rifle rested across his shoulder. In one hand he carried a canvas-wrapped bundle that smelled faintly of blood and cold meat. Tahu Lone Elk looked at the room without surprise. Voss found his voice first. This meeting is not open to you. I heard my name through the wall. This is council business. Tahu's eyes moved from Voss to the gathered families, then to the papers on the table. You're talking about children as if their mother is already dead. No one answered him. Mara felt her heart strike once hard. Tahu set the canvas bundle on the nearest bench. I'll take them, he said. The widow and all 6, through winter. The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of every fear the town had ever made of him. Mara stepped out of the shadows. I am here. Tahu turned toward her. His face did not soften, but something in his attention changed. He saw her fully. Not as a burden, not as a problem, as the only person in the room whose answer mattered. You heard, he said. Enough. Then you know what I'm offering. I know what you said. She folded her arms against the cold still clinging to her sleeves. I do not know you. I do not know your cabin. I do not know why a man who lives alone would invite 6 children and a widow into his winter. Most men wouldn't. That is not an answer. "No," he said, "but it is true." She held his gaze. There was no charm in him, no polished pity, no hunger she could see, only a blunt steadiness that gave nothing away except that he meant what he had said. "I would need to see the place. Fair. I would need to speak to my children, of course. And if I say no, then it is no." He looked past her once at Voss, then back. "A forced yes is no better than theft." Mara believed that sentence more than she believed anything Mayor Voss had said all day. She nodded once. Then she walked out into the dark. The road home seemed longer than it had in daylight. Snow began again, fine as ash, brushing her face and shawl. By the time she reached the house, her skirts were stiff with ice at the hem, and the windows glowed faintly from the fire Caleb had kept alive. He was awake at the table, Jonah's old rifle cloth in his hands. He looked up before she shut the door. "Did they decide what happens to us?" Mara stood with the cold behind her and her children sleeping beyond him. "They tried," she said. Caleb did not move when Mara said it. He sat with Jonah's rifle cloth twisted between both hands, his face lit on one side by the stove and dark on the other. He had his father's eyes gray in daylight and nearly black in firelight, and in that moment they looked older than 15 had any right to look. They tried how he asked. Mara closed the door against the wind and stood a moment with her back to it. Snow melted on her shawl and ran cold down the back of her neck. She could have lied to him. Not all of it. Not the kind of lie that rots a house from the inside, but she could have softened the edges, wrapped the truth in motherly cloth, made it easier for him to hear. She was too tired for that, and he was too close to being a man to be treated like a child when the danger had already named him. "They met last Tuesday," she said. "They decided where each of you would go if I could not feed you." His hand stopped moving. Naomi stirred under the quilt near the stove, but did not wake. Clara's small foot kicked loose from beneath the covers. Mara crossed the room and tucked it back in before she could continue. Where Caleb asked. "You to the logging camp north of the ridge." His face changed so little most folks would not have seen it. Mara did. Naomi, the Carvers, Levi, the Hanley's farm. He swallowed once. Silas, the Mercers. The room seemed to take in a breath and hold it. And Annie and Clara, he asked, together, with Reverend Cole's sister. Caleb stood so fast the chair scraped hard over the floor. Naomi woke, then eyes open, instantly alert. Levi lifted his head from the wall. He had not been sleeping after all, Mara realized. He had been listening the way Levi listened, still as a closed book with every page awake inside. "They can't," Caleb said. "They mean to. They can't take us. If I cannot find another way, they will call it lawful and kind." Naomi pushed herself up slowly, careful not to wake Clara. What other way? Mara looked from one child to the next. In the low orange light, they looked carved out of hunger and winter. Too thin already. Too quiet in the wrong places. 3 weeks ago they had been ordinary children under a hard roof. Now they sat like people at a verdict. "A man offered shelter," Mara said. "For all of us." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What man? Tahu Lone Elk." The name sat between them. Levi's gaze sharpened. Naomi drew the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "The mountain man," Caleb said. "Yes, the one folks say lives above the north slope. Yes, the one they don't trust." Mara took off her gloves, finger by finger, and laid them by the stove. "Those same folks plan to send you to swing an axe in a logging camp before asking your mother. I am reconsidering what their trust is worth." Caleb looked toward the room where Jonah lay behind the closed door. "Papa wouldn't have done this," Mara said. "Your father would have found another way before any of this came close. Then we should find one. We are trying. You don't know him." "No. He could be worse than town. He could." Naomi wrapped her arms around herself. "Did he ask anything?" "No. No money. No. No work from us." "He did not speak of terms." Caleb let out a short, bitter breath. "That makes it worse." "Maybe," Mara said. "Maybe it means he has no pretty words to hide behind." Levi had been silent so long that when he spoke, the sound seemed to come from deeper in the room. "If we stay here, they split us." Mara looked at him. He kept his eyes on the stove. "If we go with him, maybe he is dangerous. Maybe the mountain is. Maybe all of it is." "But we stay together," Naomi whispered Levi. He looked at his sister, then 12 years old and already doing arithmetic with fear. "I would rather be afraid together than safe apart." No one answered for a long while. The wind moved against the walls. Jonah's body lay in the other room under the quilt. Silas, still awake near the stove, turned the little pine shape in his hands and said nothing at all. Mara felt the words settle in her chest, not as comfort but as truth. There was no safe choice, not anymore. There were only different kinds of danger, and only one of them left her children within reach of her hands. At sunup, she said, "I will ask to see his place." Caleb looked at her. "I'm going." "No, I am. You will stay with the others." His jaw tightened. "You expect me to let you walk up a mountain with a stranger? I expect you to keep this house breathing until I return." That struck him harder than refusal. She saw it. The burden of being needed did what command could not. He looked away first. Before daylight, Mara walked into Bitterroot Crossing through air so cold it made her teeth ache. The town had not yet fully woken. Lamps burned in a few windows. The horses outside Ferris's store stood with frost on their manes. She found Tahu Lone Elk at the trading post speaking with Sister Eliza Crow over a folded bundle of dried roots. Eliza was a small, strong woman with black hair braided down her back and a wool shawl wrapped over one shoulder. Her face held that ageless quality some women had after delivering babies' dressing wounds and burying secrets for half a settlement. Old Amos Pike sat by the stove with a tin cup in both hands. Tahu, turned before the doorbell, finished its weak little rattle. "Mrs. Redfield," he said, "I want to see the cabin." He studied her face. Now. The North Trail is hard after last night's snow. I did not expect it to be easy. Something almost like approval moved through his eyes and disappeared. Amos leaned forward. "Mara." She looked at him. "Tahu ain't gentle," the old man said. "Wouldn't know how if the Lord wrote instructions on a shovel handle, but he ain't wicked." Tahu did not react to that. Amos continued quieter. "There's men in this town I'd fear more in a warm parlor than I'd fear him on a mountain." Mara held his gaze and nodded once. It was not reassurance exactly. Reassurance was too clean a word for the morning, but it was something she could carry. Eliza tied the bundle of bitterroot and handed it to Tahu. "For the stores," she said. Then to Mara. "A mountain tells the truth faster than people do. Watch how his place is kept." Mara remembered that. They left town without further talk. The North Trail rose sharply beyond the last fences, entering Lodgepole Pine where the snow lay blue in the shadows. Tahu walked ahead at a steady pace, neither hurrying her nor slowing in a way that insulted her. His tracks broke the crust. She stepped where he stepped when she could. Twice she slipped. Twice he stopped and waited without reaching for her. She found she preferred that. Below them, Bitterroot Crossing shrank to a scatter of roofs and smoke. The valley opened in pieces through the trees, white fields, black creek lines, the far blue shoulders of the mountains. Ravens moved overhead, speaking their rough language to one another. Once Tahu paused and crouched near a line of tracks crossing the trail. "Elk," he said. "How old?" "Before moonset. Moving slow. Snow is crusted higher up." She did not know what that meant fully, but she understood that he knew, because noticing kept him alive. After 2 hours, they reached a clearing cut into the north slope. The cabin stood low and solid beneath snow-heavy pines, its chimney sending a straight ribbon of smoke into the pale sky. A lean-to crouched on one side with a mule inside. Behind the cabin stood a smokehouse. Wood was stacked along the wall, more wood than Mara had seen in one place since fall. She stopped without meaning to. Tahu waited by the door. Inside the cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft, a stone hearth, a table, a workbench, and tools hung in orderly rows. It smelled of pine smoke, dried herbs, leather tobacco, and meat. Sacks of flour and beans stood on low boards. Braids of dried roots hung from a beam. Snowshoes leaned beside the door. A rifle rested above the hearth. It was not a kind place, but it was a kept place. Mara walked the room slowly, looking for neglect, for rot, for filth, for signs of a man who had lost the human habit of order. She found roughness. She found solitude. She did not find carelessness. "The loft," she said. "You and the children take it. I sleep below. The little girls cannot climb down that ladder half asleep. I can put a rail on it. Until then, pallets by the hearth. 6 children are not quiet. I expect not. You live alone." "I know." "You may find you prefer it. I already prefer it," he said. She looked at him then. He stood near the hearth, large and still, and for the first time since the meeting hall, she saw the cost of the offer in him. He was not pretending this would be easy. He was not pretending he wanted noise under his roof. That honesty mattered more than kindness would have. "Why?" she asked. He looked toward the small window where the valley was only a white distance beyond the glass. I do not want a crowded winter, he said. I do not want noise. I do not want trouble. But what the town means to do is wrong, and I have a roof. That was all. No sermon, no claim on her gratitude, no soft-eyed pity. Mara looked at the hearth, the wood, the food, the tools, the narrow beds that did not yet exist but could. She thought of Caleb's hard face, Naomi's steady hands, Levi's terrible sentence, Silas carving in silence Annie's questions, Clara's loose foot kicked out from the quilt. When would we come? When you decide. Tomorrow morning, she said, and felt the fear of it pass through her like cold water. Tahu nodded as if she had given him a weather report. On the way down, the sky lowered. Snow began before they reached town. At the edge of Bitterroot Crossing, Tahu stopped. I will bring the mule at first light, he said. Mara looked past him toward the road home. My son will not trust you. He should not. That answer surprised her. Tahu shifted the bundle of roots under his arm. Trust given too quickly is usually need wearing a nicer coat. Mara almost smiled. Almost. By evening, the Redfield house had been reduced to what could be carried. Blankets, clothes, Jonah's rifle, Naomi's sewing basket, Levi's school books, Silas's carvings, a kettle, a pan, Jonah's tools, the seed packets he had saved in careful paper folds from the last garden he would ever plant. Caleb packed without speaking. At dawn, Tahu came with the mule in a two-wheeled cart. Mayor Voss appeared too wrapped in his good coat, his hat held in both hands like grief he had borrowed for the occasion. Mara, he said, I hope you understand the arrangements we discussed were never meant as cruelty. She tied a rope over the load and pulled it tight. I understand exactly what they were meant as, Voss colored faintly. You waited for hunger to make my answer easier, she said. That is not mercy. Old Amos, standing by the fence, lowered his eyes to hide whatever moved across his face. No one said more. The children climbed or walked into place. Annie rode on the cart beside the bedding. Clara sat in Naomi's lap until the trail grew steep. Silas walked near the back, his fist closed around the small wooden thing he had been carving. Caleb and Levi took positions behind the cart when the road began to climb. The last mile nearly turned them back. The trail narrowed against a drop white with snow. The mule strained. One wheel slid sideways and Caleb threw his shoulder into the cart with a sound that was more anger than effort. Levi pushed beside him. Mara grabbed the side rail. Tahu caught the mule's bridle and spoke low in a language Mara did not know steady as a drumbeat. The cart held. They reached the clearing near midday, breathless and shaken and too tired to feel triumph. Tahu opened the cabin door and stepped aside. The children entered first. The space filled instantly with body's breath questions and cold coming off wool. Naomi went straight to the hearth. Levi's eyes found the tools. Annie stood in the middle of the room turning in a slow circle. Clara asked if the mule could come inside. Caleb remained near the door watching Tahu as if the man might change shape now that he had them under his roof. Silas did not enter fully. He stood with one foot still on the threshold. Then he looked at Tahu and asked, What happened to your wife? The whole room froze. Mara opened her mouth, but Tahu had already turned. She died, he said. Silas waited. In a storm above Lost Horse Creek, I went after her and came back with only her shawl. The boy's fingers tightened around his carving. Do you still miss her? Tahu's eyes did not leave him. Every morning before I remember how to stand. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. That night Mara lay awake in the loft with her children around her and listened to Tahu feed the fire below. Snow tapped at the window like small fingers. The cabin creaked. Someone breathed. Someone dreamed. Beneath it all, the mountain kept its silence. By morning, there would be no easy way back to Bitterroot Crossing. Whatever this cabin became, they would have to become it together. By the second morning, the cabin had learned the sound of children, and Tahu Lone Elk had learned that silence once broken did not return just because a man missed it. Clara woke first. She sat up on her pallet near the hearth hair, wild from sleep, and stared at Tahu where he sat by the low fire lacing one snowshoe. He had slept there on the floor with his coat folded beneath his head and a blanket pulled only halfway over him, as if comfort was something he had never made a full agreement with. Do you eat breakfast? Clara asked. Tahu paused with the rawhide lace between his fingers. Yes, every day when there is breakfast. She considered this. Mama says there is always something if a body looks hard enough. Mara, awake in the loft above, closed her eyes for 1 second and wondered whether it was possible to be grateful and mortified at the same time. Tahu looked at the fire. Your mama sounds practical. She is, Clara said. She can make beans taste different even when they are still beans. That was the first real conversation Clara had with him, and it set the manner of things better than any adult arrangement could have. By sunrise, Annie had joined her near the hearth. Naomi was climbing down from the loft with Clara's boots in one hand and a warning already forming in her mouth. Levi was studying the tools along the wall as if they were a language he meant to learn, and Caleb stood near the door with his arms folded watching Tahu as if one honest answer about a dead wife did not erase the fact that they were under a stranger's roof. Silas came down last. He carried the small pine carving in his palm. In the daylight, it had become something like a fox, though still rough in the ears and too heavy in the tail. He set it on the windowsill without explanation and went to help Naomi with the water bucket. Tahu noticed. He didn't speak of it. That restraint Mara thought was either kindness or ignorance. With Tahu, she had not yet learned which was which. The first days were made of small frictions, nothing large enough to name, nothing sharp enough to point at and say, there, that is the trouble. But trouble did not always come with boots on. Sometimes it came as 7 bodies trying to move through a space built for one. The children knocked elbows at the table. Clara cried because Annie breathed on her spoon. Levi asked what a tool was called while Tahu was in the middle of carrying wood and nearly dropped half the load answering. Naomi found the flour sacks too close to the floor and stood staring at them with the grave disapproval of a housewife 3 times her age. They'll dampen from underneath, she said. Tahu, who had been eating beans from a tin plate, looked up. They have not yet. That is because you have not had 8 people drawing steam into one room and tracking snow across the floor all day. Mara expected him to bristle. Most men did when corrected by a 14-year-old girl. Tahu only set down his fork. What would you change? Naomi blinked once, as if she had prepared herself for resistance and did not know what to do with cooperation. Shelves, she said after a moment, high enough for air to move under, flour on one side, dried meat away from it, roots near the door but not where they freeze solid, and the older sacks used first, not the ones easiest to reach. Tahu listened without interrupting. Then he looked at Levi. There is pine board behind the smokehouse. We will cut it after midday. Naomi lowered her eyes quickly, but Mara saw the pleased set of her shoulders before she turned away. Levi was already at the workbench before the meal was done. Tahu showed him the draw knife, the awl, the snare wire, the way rawhide should be soaked before mending snowshoe webbing. He did not make lessons out of it. He simply did the thing and answered when the boy asked. Levi asked often, and Tahu answered fully enough that Mara began to understand the man's patience was not warmth exactly, but something close enough to be useful. Caleb watched all of this and gave nothing. He hauled water. He split wood. He helped move shelves. He did what was asked with such exact obedience it became another form of refusal. He never stood idle, never complained, never thanked Tahu unless a direct courtesy demanded it. On the 4th night, after the younger children had fallen asleep and Naomi had climbed to the loft, Caleb sat at the table sharpening Jonah's knife. The slow scrape of stone against steel moved through the room like a saw through bone. Tao came in from checking the mule. Snow clung to his shoulders. He shut the door quietly and stood near the hearth warming his hands. The angle is right, he said. Caleb did not look up. My father taught me. I figured. Another scrape. He does not need replacing. Caleb said. The words were not loud, but they cut clean. Mara stopped mending. She was in the shadow near the ladder, half hidden, and neither of them looked toward her. Tahu took off his gloves finger by finger. No, he said. Dead men are not pushed aside by the living unless the living are fools. Caleb's hand stilled. Tahu hung his gloves on the peg. I'm not trying to stand where Jonah Redfield stood. You knew him? No. Then don't speak like you did. I speak like I know what a father leaves behind. Caleb looked at him then. Really looked. In his face was anger, grief, suspicion, and a boy's desperate need for the world to stop changing before it took the last shape of home from him. Tao held that look and did not soften beneath it. After a moment, Caleb went back to the knife. But when Tahu turned to feed the fire, Caleb reached without looking and pushed the nearest split log closer to him. It was a small thing. Mara saw it anyway. The storm came before dawn 2 days later. It struck the cabin from the west, low and hard piling snow against the wall until the windows darkened at their lower edges. The pines bent and groaned. The world beyond the door disappeared into white motion. By breakfast, the trail was gone. By noon, the lean-to roof carried a weight that made Tahu stand too long at the window. Mara came beside him. Show me how you know when it is too much. He glanced at her. It is bitter out. I did not ask if it was pleasant. Something like approval passed through him again, there and gone. He took the spare hide coat from the peg and handed it to her. Outside, the cold struck like open water. Tahu showed her how to read the bow in a roofline, how snow with a crust pulled differently than powder, how ice near the eaves meant trouble when thaw came and then froze again. He spoke plainly, no extra words, but never as if she were foolish for not already knowing. Mara listened hard. She had decided before leaving Bitterroot Crossing that she would not be useless on this mountain. The mountain had no tenderness for the useless. When they came back in their lashes white with frost, Caleb was watching from the hearth. He looked away too late to pretend he had not been. On the third afternoon of the storm, Sister Eliza Crow arrived during a brief easing of the wind with 2 Salish boys and a bundle of dried bitterroot yarrow and willow bark. Mara could not imagine how anyone had found the cabin in such weather, but Eliza stepped inside as calmly as if she had crossed a churchyard. "Tau," she said. "Eliza." That was all the greeting between them, but it carried years. Eliza showed Naomi how to soak dried roots to thicken soup and make it stretch without tasting like punishment. She showed Mara which herbs in Tahu's rafters were for fever, which for wounds, which for stomach trouble in children who ate too fast after hunger. She spoke of winter as if it were not an enemy but a stern elder who punished waste and rewarded attention. Near dusk, while the children ate, Eliza stood beside Mara at the window. Snow moved outside in long, pale sheets. "He has been alone too long," Eliza said. Mara knew she meant Tahu. He offered. Yes, that does not mean he understood what he offered. Mara watched Clara sit beside him on the bench close enough that her sleeve touched his coat. Tahu had gone rigid again, but he did not move away. Eliza's face softened. A pony wanted children. Mara looked at her. She was his wife. Eliza nodded. She laughed more than he knew what to do with. The mountain took her in a storm. He has lived ever since like a man listening for footsteps that will not come. Mara said nothing. Eliza touched the window frame. Grief kept alone turns sharp. Grief shared turns heavy, but it can be carried. The words stayed with Mara after Eliza left the following morning, vanishing down the broken trail with the boys behind her and Tahu watching from the doorway longer than he needed to. When the storm finally broke, it left the world buried and shining. Old Amos Pike arrived the next day with a mule and mail, tied under oilcloth, cursing the snow, the trail his knee and every councilman in Bitterroot Crossing in equal measure. He found Tahu and Caleb outside near the west wall, driving support stakes where the storm had pressed adrift hard against the cabin. Caleb held the post steady. Tahu swung the mallet. They worked without speaking. Amos stood with his hands on his hips and watched them. "Well," he said, "at last a man does not become family by name. He becomes family by standing where the cold comes in." Caleb's ears reddened. Tahu drove the last strike into the post and said nothing. But Mara, standing in the doorway with Annie tucked against her skirt, felt the sentence settle over the clearing, like another kind of weather. By January, the cabin had begun to arrange itself around them. Naomi's shelves stood along the wall. Levi had learned to mend a snare and could name 3 kinds of tracks by the window. Clara had decided Tahu was a suitable place to sit near at supper. Annie followed him to feed the mule when allowed. Silas's fox remained on the windowsill, joined now by a rough little bear with shoulders too large and eyes cut deep. Teo picked it up one evening, turned it once in his hands, and set it back carefully. "The weight is right," he said. Silas looked at him. "Bears carry their heads lower than folks draw them." Tahu added, "You saw that." "My father said I noticed things," Silas said. "He was right. That was all, but Silas kept the bear on the sill after that instead of putting it away." The warmth they found was not easy warmth. It had to make room for hunger. Naomi's shelves told the truth better than guessing ever had. Flour was lower than it should be. Beans, too. The dried meat had gone faster than Tahu expected, though none of the children ate greedily. Children were simply hunger, with faces growing whether winter permitted it or not. Mara counted the stores twice. Tahu had already counted them once. She found him outside by the lean-to, studying the sky above the ridge. "How long?" he asked. 5 weeks, she said. 6 if we cut portions again. We do not cut the children again." She looked at him then. He had said we. He seemed not to notice. "There are elk above the high ridge," he said. "South-facing slopes. Wind keeps the snow thinner." "How far?" 3, maybe 4 miles above here. Dangerous." Yes, he did not dress it up. That was one of the reasons she had begun to trust him, and one of the reasons trusting him was so difficult. "Avalanche country?" she asked. "In places. Mountain lion. If blood draws one." The air between them went still. He looked at the pale sky, reading what she could not yet read. One elk carries us into spring. Mara folded her arms against the cold. She wanted to tell him no. The word rose in her and met the shelves inside the children's faces, the little girl's wrists too thin beneath their sleeves. She did not ask him not to go. She knew what survival cost. She had known it since the night she put a log on the fire beside her dead husband's room. "I'm not asking you not to go," she said. "I'm asking you to come back." Tahu looked at her, and for once the stillness in his face shifted. "Then I will aim myself home," he said. Before dawn, he left with the mule, the rifle snowshoes rope, and dried meat wrapped in cloth. Caleb stood in the doorway, pretending not to understand the weight of the journey. Mara did not tell the younger children more than they needed to know. Tahu crossed the clearing without looking back. Snow began again as he reached the trees, thin at first, then thicker, softening the shape of his shoulders until the mountain took him in. By the time his tracks filled in, Mara understood that the mountain had taken one man from her life already, and now another had walked willingly into its mouth. The first day without Tahu lone elk passed in a kind of discipline Mara did not trust. Nothing went wrong. That was what made it hard. The fire held. The mule stayed calm. The younger girls ate their breakfast without argument, except for Clara objecting to a piece of dried root because it looked in her judgment too much like a dead worm. Naomi corrected the food stores after the morning meal, moving one sack of flour higher on the new shelf and noting aloud that the beans would last longer if no one stirred them, as if they were washing gravel. Levi took Annie and Clara through their letters at the table. Silas sat near the window with his knife and a strip of pine, making thin, pale shavings that gathered in his lap like curled snow. Caleb went out 3 times before noon to look at the ridge. Each time he came back with the same face he had left with. Mara said nothing about it. She had already looked twice herself. The mountain above the cabin was hidden most of the morning behind a white veil of blowing snow. It did not storm properly, not with the violence of the earlier blizzard, but it breathed snow from the high ridges in long, bitter sighs. The sky stayed low and colorless. By afternoon, Tahu's tracks were gone, entirely covered over, as if he had never walked there at all. Mara kept her hands busy, because hands were easier to govern than thoughts. She checked the hearth. She hauled water. She mended the tear in Annie's stocking. She scraped frost from the lower edge of the window and pretended not to feel the emptiness in the room where Tahu's silence usually sat. That was the thing she had not expected. A quiet man could still leave a loud absence. The second day began with Caleb standing in the doorway before dawn, already dressed, Jonah's knife at his belt. "You are not going after him," Mara said before he spoke. His mouth tightened. "I know the lower trail. You know the part below the split pine. I know more than that. You do not know avalanche snow, and you do not know where an elk runs when wounded." He looked past her into the gray morning. "If he does not come back, he said he would aim himself home. That is not the same as getting here." Mara crossed the room and set one hand against the doorframe, blocking nothing and everything. "No, it is not. But sending you into the same mountain does not pull him out of it." Caleb held her eyes for a long moment, and in him she saw the old kitchen in Bitterroot Crossing. The night Jonah died, the boy swinging a pickaxe into frozen ground because it was the only thing strong enough to receive his anger. Then he stepped back. "I will check the mule," he said. "That would be useful." "I was not asking to be useful. I know. He went out anyway." By noon, the children had begun to feel the strain of waiting. Annie asked whether Tahu knew how to find the cabin in snow. Naomi answered yes too quickly. Clara wanted to know if elk bit. Levi said they did not unless one placed a hand in the wrong place, which led to a conversation Mara did not have the strength to interrupt. Silas carved until the shape in his hand became something with heavy shoulders and a low head. A bear, perhaps. Or grief learning to walk on 4 feet. Toward evening, the mule screamed. It was not a bray. It was not the usual complaint of an animal wanting feed or objecting to weather. It was a sharp, high sound from the lean-to that lifted every head in the cabin. Mara was at the door before she decided to move. The clearing outside had gone blue with dusk. Snow lay soft over everything. For one terrible second, she saw nothing but the pines and the dim shape of the lean-to. Then the mule lurched into view, reins, dragging eyes, white steam blowing from its nostrils. A dark weight was tied across its back. Elk meat, too much of it for a trap check. Enough to mean Tahu had found what he went for. Then Tahu appeared at the far edge of the clearing. He was walking. That was the first thing Mara saw, and her body took one breath on that alone. Then she saw how he walked. His left hand held the mule's rein, his right arm hung stiff and wrong. His coat was black from shoulder to wrist, not with shadow but with blood. His face had gone the color of old ash, and each step seemed chosen separately from the one before it. Mara crossed the snow. What happened? Tahu stopped because she put both hands on him and made him stop. That frightened her more than the blood. Tahu, lone elk, did not stop because someone touched him unless stopping was all he had left. "Cat," he said. His voice was flat, too flat. She pulled his coat open at the shoulder and saw the wounds. 3 long tracks, deep and ragged, carved from the top of his right shoulder down into the arm. The cloth beneath was soaked through. He had packed it with strips torn from his own shirt, but the bleeding had only slowed in the cold. It had not ended. "Mountain lion," she said. "Came down from above. After the elk." "How long ago?" "Yesterday." She looked at him. "Yesterday?" The elk was down. For a moment, anger came so suddenly it steadied her. "Inside. I need to inside." He must have heard something in her voice because he did not argue. "Caleb," she called. The boy came running from the lean-to side, stopped when he saw Tahu, then moved again with forced control. "Take the mule," Mara said. "Get it under cover. Leave the meat tied for now." Caleb's eyes went to the elk, then to the blood, then to Tahu's face. "Yes, ma'am." Mara got Tahu into the cabin and into the chair nearest the hearth. Naomi saw the wound and went pale, but she did not freeze. "Water," Mara said. "Hot as you can make it. Clean cloths. Levi, take Annie and Clara to the far corner. Keep them there." Silas moved that stool by the fire. No one asked why. That was how fear became useful in a house that still meant to live. Mara cut away the ruined cloth. Tahu sat with his jaw set, his good hand gripping the chair arm. The fire gave her light enough to see what she wished she did not have to see. Torn skin, dark blood, places where the claw had gone deep enough to leave her stomach cold. She had stitched children before. A split forehead, a ripped palm, a fishhook dragged wrong through flesh. This was different. This was a man held together by will and weather. She cleaned the wounds with hot water first. Tahu's breath changed, but he made no sound. She cleaned them again with spirits from the small brown bottle on his shelf that made his hand clamp so hard on the chair arm that the wood creaked. "You should have come back as soon as it happened," she said. "The elk would have been gone by morning. You were torn open, not dead." She looked up from the blood. His eyes met hers. They were clearer than his voice, and more stubborn than any man bleeding that badly had a right to be. Something in Mara broke the surface then. Not softness, not yet. Fear with its coat turned inside out. Do not die proving you are useful to people who already need you alive. The room went very still. Tahu held her gaze. For once he had no plain answer ready. "I heard you," he said at last. It was not a promise. She knew him well enough now to know he would not make one he could not command. But it was an answer. With Tahu, sometimes that had to be enough. She threaded the curved needle from his kit and stitched the worst of it, while Naomi held the lamp with both hands. Tahu watched Mara's hands, not the wound. Once, when she had to pull the torn edges together, his face tightened, and the sound that left him was almost nothing. That almost nothing hurt worse to hear than a cry would have. When she tied off the last stitch, sweat stood on his forehead. "You need to stay by the fire," she said. "You need water. You need stillness." "The elk. Caleb will handle it. He has never dressed a whole elk. He will tonight." Tahu tried to stand. Mara put one hand flat on his chest. "No. I can talk him through the hanging, from the chair, outside." "No." His eyes moved toward the door where Caleb stood, snow on his boots, waiting because he had heard enough to understand the work was now his. "If it hangs wrong, we lose meat," Tahu said. "If we lose meat, the shelves empty before thaw." Mara hated that he was right. She hated more that the children needed him, right, even wounded. 20 minutes, she said. "You sit on the rail. You do not lift. You do not cut. You talk. Caleb works." Tahu nodded once. Caleb did the butchering by lantern light under a sky full of hard stars. Mara watched from the doorway while Tahu sat wrapped in a blanket on the low rail, pale as bone but upright, his voice steady enough to carry. "Start behind the shoulder. Not there. Lower. Let the knife follow the seam. Do not fight bone." Caleb's hands shook at first. Then they steadied. Blood steamed on the snow. The elk's great body became labor, then food, then the difference between hunger and survival. Caleb listened to every word. Tahu corrected without scorn. The boy adjusted without pride. It was terrible work. It was necessary work. By the time they finished the first hanging, Caleb's face had changed. Not softer, not healed, but changed in the way iron changes after heat finds it. Tahu lasted 27 minutes before Mara dragged him back inside, and she did not mention the extra 7 because he did not have strength left to enjoy winning them. For 2 days they believed the worst had passed, then the wound reddened. At first it was only warmth at the edges, then swelling, then fever. By the 3rd night, Tahu lay on a pallet near the hearthskin, hot beneath Mara's hand, his breath rough and uneven. The cabin moved around him with careful purpose. Naomi kept water heating. Levi held Annie and Clara inside a wall of quiet stories. Caleb checked the woodpile and the mule without being asked. Silas sat across from Tahu with his bear carving in his lap and watched. Mara sent Caleb down the lower trail at first light to leave a strip of red cloth on the split pine, the signal old Amos had said would bring help if ever there was need. Amos came by dusk with Sister Eliza Crow behind him, on a dun pony, her face hard from cold and worry. Eliza examined the wound and said little. She packed it with bitter-smelling herbs, made Tahu drink a dark tea, and told Mara to keep him warm, but not smothered wet cloth on the headwater whenever he surfaced. "Will he live?" Mara asked. Eliza looked at the man by the fire. "The body is fighting," she said. "Sometimes the spirit has to be called back too." That night the fever rose. Tahu spoke in fragments: elk, ridge, snow crust, a pony. The name came out once low and broken, and Mara felt it enter the room like another ghost. Silas looked up from the fire. After midnight, when Naomi had finally dozed against the wall, and Caleb sat outside the door cooling his face in the dark, Silas moved closer to Mara. "Does he hurt like us?" he whispered. Mara looked at Tahu's face, stripped by fever of all its guarded weather. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like us." Silas held the carved bear in both hands. Then he should not be alone in it. He placed the bear beside Tahu's pallet. Mara stayed until dawn. She changed cloths. She lifted Tahu's head and gave him water. She said, "You are here," when his eyes moved without seeing. She said, "Come back," once so quietly she barely heard herself. Near first light, the heat broke. Tahu's breathing eased. The terrible dry burn under Mara's palm softened into ordinary warmth. She sat back against the hearthstones and closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them, Tahu was looking at her. "You stayed," he said. His voice was raw. Mara wrung out the cloth again, though it no longer needed wringing. "Someone had to teach you what it feels like." He didn't ask what she meant. Outside, the morning came pale over the snow. Caleb entered carrying 2 rabbits from the lower snares, his coat white with frost. He stopped when he saw Tahu awake. "The east snare was wrong," Caleb said after a moment. "I fixed it." Tahu looked at him, weak but fully present. "Good," he said. "One word." Caleb nodded, as if more had been given than anyone else could hear. Mara looked from the hanging elk outside the window to the wooden bear beside the pallet, to the children moving quietly through the cabin as if around something precious. Winter had brought them to his door as strangers. By morning, fear had made them something harder to separate. March came soft at first, not warm enough to trust, but soft enough to make the snow lose its certainty. It began at the eaves. Thin drops fell in the afternoon and froze again by dark, making small glass teeth along the cabin roof. Then the south-facing slope below the clearing showed patches of brown grass, flattened and dead-looking, but visible, which made Annie clap her hands as if the earth itself had come back from burial. Clara tried to dig a hole with a spoon and had to be stopped before she ruined both the spoon and her mittens. Tahu healed with the patience of a wolf caught in a trap, which was to say, not patiently. The fever left him weak, though he resented the fact as if weakness were a debt collector who had come to the wrong door. He could sit up after 2 days, stand after 4. By the 6th, he tried to carry wood with his left arm and nearly dropped the whole bundle at the threshold. Mara saw it from the table. She said nothing. She got up, took half the wood from him, and carried it to the hearth. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them wasted words on what both already knew. That became the way of his recovery. Tahu would overreach. Mara would quietly take the part of the work his body could not yet bear. Naomi did the same with less quiet and more efficiency. Levi found reasons to be nearby when something needed 2 hands. Even Silas, who was not strong, carried kindling in small bundles and stacked it carefully beside the stove. Caleb did not hover. He simply began walking the lower trapline before Tahu could get his boots on. The first morning it happened, Tahu stood by the door with his coat half buttoned and found Caleb already outside, rifle across his shoulder, breath white in the gray dawn. "You know the east snare," Tahu said. "I know it. The creek crossing is crusted. Step wide. I know that too." Tahu studied him a moment. "Then go." Caleb went. When he returned with one rabbit and a face that had taken in the whole morning without asking permission, Tahu nodded once. No praise, no ceremony, just the nod of one working man to another. Mara watched through the window and felt something loosen inside her that grief had tied hard. The cabin shifted with the thaw, not just the wood and the roof and the ground underneath, but the people. Annie and Clara no longer asked when they were going home. They sat outside for the clearing down below for Bitterroot Crossing, and inside for the cabin, as if the word itself had chosen sides. Naomi had taken full command of the shelves. Levi had begun drawing the south slope in the margins of an old route map, marking where a garden might stand, if the rocks could be cleared and if the sun held long enough. Silas carved an elk. It stood beside the fox and bear on the windowsill, lean-legged and alert, its head turned as if listening to something beyond the glass. Tahu picked it up one evening, turned it carefully in his left hand, and set it back. "Legs are better," he said. Silas nodded. That was all, but the boy carried the words around for 2 days. In the second week of March, Mara took Jonah's seed packets from the inner pocket of her coat. The paper had softened from months of being handled and kept close. Corn, beans, squash, a few herbs. Jonah had dried himself labeling them in his square, patient hand. She found shallow boxes near the workbench and filled them with dark soil, scraped from beneath the lean-to, the only earth not locked solid under snow. The children gathered around as if she were opening a chest of gold. "Will they grow?" Annie asked. "I do not know, but maybe." Mara pressed one seed into the dirt. "Maybe is enough to start with." For 5 mornings they checked the boxes and found nothing. On the 6th, Clara announced green where there was no green. On the 7th, Levi told her that wishing was not the same as seeing. On the 8th, a pale thread pushed through the dirt. No one spoke for a while. Even Tahu, who had come to the table for coffee, stopped beside the window and looked down at that small new thing. His face held no expression Mara could name, but he looked longer than anyone else. By late March, he began cutting posts for a room on the south side of the cabin. "It is practical," he said when Mara found him measuring the ground. She looked at the stakes, the stretched cord, the place where sunlight touched the snow longest. "Is it? The loft is crowded. The girls are growing. If the roofline extends here, it will hold better against west wind. All practical reasons, yes, and none of them say whether you expect us gone by summer." He looked at her then. The scar across his shoulder had pulled stiff under his shirt, and the cold had put color back in his face. He was still thinner than before the fever, but he stood like the mountain had not managed to take enough to matter. "I do not expect what is not decided," he said, "but you are cutting posts. Wood takes time." It was such a Tahu answer that Mara almost smiled. Caleb helped from the first day. Tahu showed him how to read grain, how to notch a joint, how to set a post so thawing ground would not twist it out of true. Caleb listened with the full weight of himself, not obedient now, invested. Levi hovered nearby asking questions until Tahu handed him a measuring cord and told him to be useful with his curiosity. Mara turned away the first time she saw Caleb and Tahu lift a beam together. Not because it hurt. Because it did, but not in the way she feared. Jonah was not being replaced. His place remained where it had always been in Caleb's eyes, in Naomi's careful hands, in Levi's quiet reckoning, in Silas's carvings, in the seed packets lifting green at the window. But life had not stopped at the grave. It had gone on stubborn and almost offensive in its insistence, and somehow that seemed less like betrayal now than mercy. The riders came before noon on a day bright enough to make the snow glare. Mara heard the horses first. Tahu came from the half-framed room with a hammer in his left hand. Caleb stepped out beside him. Naomi appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. The little girls pressed behind her. Silas stood near the window where the fox, bear, and elk watched the clearing with wooden patience. Mayor Ephraim Voss rode in with Dale Ferris and Councilman Harlan beside him. Old Amos Pike followed on his mule, and by the set of his jaw, Mara guessed he had not come because he was invited. Sister Eliza Crow appeared from the lower trail, not long after her shawl, dark against the snow, as if the mountain itself had decided Mara should not stand unwitnessed. Voss dismounted slowly. He looked at the cabin, the high woodpile, the smoked elk hanging in proper cuts, the new shelves visible through the open door, the children thin but bright-eyed, clothed and fed and very much together. "You look well, Mara," he said. "We are well." His gaze moved to Tahu, to the bandage still under his shirt, to Caleb standing near him with sawdust on his sleeves. "We came to inquire after the children's welfare." Mara stepped down into the clearing. "Look well, then. This is what your mercy would have broken." Voss's face tightened. Ferris looked away first. Old Amos sat his mule in silence, but his silence had weight. Eliza came to stand near Mara, not touching her, not speaking, simply there. Voss removed his hat. The council acted hastily. You acted without asking. Yes, he said after a moment. Without asking. That cost him something. Not enough to undo winter, but enough for Mara to hear truth in it. The children are clearly cared for, he said. They are alive, Mara said. They are together. That was the whole point. Voss looked at the 6 of them again. Caleb did not lower his eyes. Naomi held Clara's hand. Levi watched every adult as if he meant to remember exact words. Annie leaned against the doorframe. Silas stayed by the window, one hand resting near the wooden animals. The settlement will support whatever arrangement you choose going forward, Voss said. Mara let the words settle. I will remember you said that with others listening. Amos gave a small grunt that might have been approval. The men did not stay long. They drank water because refusing would have made them look small, then rode back toward town with less certainty than they had brought up the trail. When the trees took them, the clearing seemed larger. Tahu stood beside Mara watching the empty trail. You can still go back, he said. I know, I mean it. I know that too. He looked at the half-built room, then at the south slope where the snow had begun to pull away from the earth. I'm not asking you to forget the dead. I'm asking whether the living may keep building. Mara looked toward the window. The green shoots leaned toward the light. Jonah's seeds, Tahu's soil, her children between them. I'm still grieving him, she said. I would not trust you if you were not. And you? A pony is still in this weather, he said. Some mornings more than others. That answer hurt because it was honest. Mara breathed in the cold pine and smoke and thawing earth. Then we build, she said. Summer came by degrees. The room was finished. The garden went in rough and crooked and real. Jonah's seeds took root beside potatoes Tahu had saved. Naomi learned from Eliza how to dry herbs. Levi expanded his drawings into plans. Caleb asked Tahu to teach him the mountain through all 4 seasons, and Tahu shook his hand like the request deserved a contract. Silas sold one carving to a passing trader and spent 2 days deciding whether money improved a thing or complicated it. By September, the woodpile stood taller than Mara. The garden had not given abundantly, but it had given enough to promise better. The cabin no longer looked like one man's shelter with too many lives pressed into it. It looked altered, claimed, made wider by need and work. One evening, as the valley darkened below and the Bitterroot ridges turned purple under the last gold light, Mara stood outside listening to the children inside. Naomi and Levi argued about storage space. Annie laughed. Clara called something no one understood. Caleb's voice answered lower than before, nearly a man's. Silas's knife made small, careful sounds against wood. Tahu came to stand beside her. Why are you staying, Mara? He asked. Truly. She looked at the room they had built, the garden settling into sleep, the mountain that had taken and given without apology. Home is where the people who could have left decide to stay, she said. Then she looked at him. And this is where my family is. Tahu took her hand. No speech followed. None was needed. Inside, Clara called Mama. Nothing was wrong. She only wanted to know where her mother had gone. Coming, Mara said. She went inside, into the firelight, into the noise, into the life still unfinished and already theirs. On the windowsill, the fox, the bear, and the elk faced the darkening mountain. Outside, the first stars came over the ridges. Inside, the door closed against the cold.